Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning as we continue our webinars in the wake and ongoing developments related to the COVID-19 epidemic. We know that each morning we wake up to new news about how COVID-19 is impacting our economy and our communities. We at Miller Johnson believe that we can best mitigate the fallout from this crisis by working together, hosting events like this with clients, community organizations, other professionals, and the government. We are lucky to practice and live in a community that prizes collaboration, intellect, loyalty, candor, and ingenuity. And as those who have joined our prior webinars know, these are our guiding principles each day as we navigate through these uncharted waters. Again, we start off all these presentations before proceeding to the substance by considering the many thousands of people who have already been impacted by the pandemic across the globe, as well as in our local communities, and to also consider how many more lives, families, and jobs will be impaired in the weeks and months ahead, particularly here in Michigan in light of our topic today. Here in West Michigan, we also have healthcare professionals, pharmacists, grocers, mail delivery people, and so many others who are bracing for the storm that's coming. And we are here to help their employers, to help them, and to help the community at large. And while we can't stop what may come ultimately, we can adapt a constructive mindset that recognizes our shared sensibilities toward coworkers, employees, business partners, our local economies, and for a law firm, the principles of law. With that said, I'll turn over the microphone shortly following introductions to our group here today, who's made time to talk to us about the breaking news around the Big Three auto shutdown that is happening right now as we speak, and will be continuing to happen over the coming days. The panelists today are CJ Schneider, who is a litigator here in Grand Rapids at Miller Johnson, who specializes in automotive disputes. Bob Wolford, who, in addition to being one of the firm's co-managing members, is a corporate attorney with a practice in restructuring, corporate law, and mergers and acquisitions. Keith Eastland, who represents our labor and employment group. Myself, I'm in the mergers and acquisitions and corporate area. This is Erik Daly speaking. And then we're fortunate to have Steve Wybo from Conway MacKenzier, who works in this area every day and who will have unique commercial insights that he can share with the audience today. So with that, I'll turn it over to CJ to get the discussion going around the substance of what's happening in real time here. CJ?
Yeah, sounds good. Thanks, Erik. Good morning, everybody. And we're going to try to progress through this, if this is going to let me move. So as everybody knows, the big news started yesterday with the three major OEMs beginning shutdowns. And we've gotten some more word through the evening and into this morning that there are other OEMs that are following suit. So as of yesterday, Ford, GM, and Chrysler all announced that they're going to shut down their North American production. Ford begins that process today, and as part of that process has stated publicly that it's going to be cleaning and sanitizing its plants through the duration of the shutdown. GM has said that it will implement rolling shutdowns. It hasn't given a whole lot of detail about what exactly that looks like, but it sounds like it's not just going to be a light switch, that there's going to be some orderly transition of plant closures here. And based on reports coming out this morning, Chrysler started its closures as of yesterday. We know that the Big Three shutdowns will last until at least March 30th. There's been some discussion in the news media that those may be extended. GM has explicitly said that it's going to review production needs on a week-by-week basis after March 30th. And so, one of the questions that I think is going to come out of these shutdowns, or at least after we get to the March 30th point, is this going to be an intermittent thing, right? Is this going to continue to happen periodically as COVID-19 surges and recedes and surges again, as they're kind of predicting through the fall here? The other two OEMs that have come out and talked about closures are Honda and Nissan. Honda is going to close from March 23rd to March 31st, and Nissan will close until April 6th. I haven't seen a whole lot of other details surrounding those closures, but those are the dates that are out there. And we can talk a little bit about why the shutdowns are occurring. So overall, the reason for the shutdowns has been, I think, and Steve, feel free to chime in here if you have any additional insight, but has been requests by the UAW. And there's been some public reports that employees in these OEM facilities have tested positive for the COVID-19 virus. We know there was a positive test in one of Ford's assembly's plants, one in Chrysler's, and then VW also reported that there was a positive test in its Auburn Hills office, and it has closed that office. GM also made reference to market conditions as part of its comments about closing, so it seems like maybe it's a little bit broader than just COVID-19. And Steve, I know you've had communications with at least two of the big three and some other suppliers and have some additional background on what's going on here. So if you want to share with the group your insights, we'd appreciate that.
Great. Thanks for inviting me, guys. These are absolutely crazy times in our industry. And for those of you that don't know me, I've been at this firm, Conway MacKenzier, for 20 years and spent all my life in automotive, including as a kid. My dad was a plant manager at a stamping plant. So this is all I do for the most part and read this stuff every day. And we have about a dozen auto clients at the firm currently. And I expect that number to grow by large multiples here once everyone gets back online. As was just said, I've been in discussions with many suppliers and OEMs and the OESA Council, CEO Council, which I speak at from time to time, discussing what's going on. And I think that, everything's been framed up appropriately. I believe, all the OEMs will be down by about Monday. And then the supply base will closely follow. As of right now, we haven't seen any dramatic declines in release schedules. I think that's coming. But I think, if you recall the GM strike last fall, for many of you supplier companies on the phone today, you didn't see a huge decline necessarily. It softened, but, the first couple of weeks, they wanted you to keep making parts because when, everyone knew ultimately the union and management would come to an agreement, they'd be back online. And what GM didn't want to have happen is part shortages all over the country. Resulting in the onlining of the vehicles and the ramping up of the assembly plants being any slower than it needed to be. Turns out that did happen because supply was all over the place, and it took them several months to get to sort of the pre-strike normal. So I think they learned a lesson from that, and they prefer, I think, that the suppliers at least keep shipping for a little bit, or at least keep building for a little bit. There may not be anyone on the receiving dock on the other end, but at least have some buffer in the supply base here. I think that's a tough ask, though, because how can the OEM send their people home due to safety, and our supplier clients, or for those of you business owners or CEOs in this call, not worry about your people's safety and health? So I'm working with two clients right now. I have calls right after this where we're going to talk about what we do with the people, but I think many of these suppliers are going to send people home regardless of what the releases say. And it will probably shortly follow the complete shutdown of the domestic three early next week. I've gotten a lot of feedback from the OESA and members of the OESA Council, and we've talked about, what do you do with the employees if you send them home in terms of their pay? And many, if not all, of the suppliers I've talked to have said we just don't have the balance sheets to pay people without, generating revenue. So unfortunately, and I think we're going to talk later in this call about what the government is asking companies to do. But unfortunately, I don't think that most of our clients, and perhaps many of you on this call have billions of dollars of excess cash sitting around, and even if you wanted to do right by your people, you may be prohibited from doing so due to limitations within your covenants or credit facilities or equity that exists at a typical middle market automotive supplier. So, I think in summary, we're going to see a massive shutdown here. It's going to be at least a couple of weeks, and then I think we're going to see a slower onboarding back to whatever the new normal is. And then I think we're going to see a sort of a permanent correction the rest of the year in terms of volumes. IHS, I've been in contact with them as well. They're going to come out with a new forecast here in the next day or so, which is going to be closer to the 15 million unit range on a SARS basis versus sort of the 17 million range that we've been operating at for the last 8 to 10 years, and what everyone was virtually predicting for this year and next. So if you think about the simple math, 20% correction on 17-ish million units down to between 14 and 15, that will be driven by demand, of course. And who knows if that number's right, but I think for many of you, for planning purposes on this call, 20%, at least a 20% reduction in volumes the rest of the year is probably prudent to plan for as a base case. We'll all hope that it's better than that. Potentially could be worse, but I think that if this was just temporary, many of the units could be made up, not all, but many. But if the demand is lighter, then clearly the OEs won't be producing units that the consumers don't want to buy this year. So, I think the last comment I have is on volumes. And, when we get this crisis behind us, I think the new normal for an extended period of time is going to be a pretty permanent, or I shouldn't say permanent, but longer term reduction in production volumes.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. We appreciate the insights. We got a couple more background pieces here, and then we can start talking about some of the legal issues. And I apologize for the slowness coming out of my machine here, but the screen's sticking. There we go. So obviously, as Steve talked about, there's going to be some significant impact on the supply chains. It's difficult to predict at this point. I think Steve's insight is excellent and as good as any as we're going to see. I think, in my view, the big question is going to be, is there going to be pent-up demand that returns from the customer base? And I don't mean supply chain customers. I mean the ultimate customers. Once everything returns, are people going to actually go out and buy large ticket items like cars once all of these quarantine measures and social distancing measures ultimately lift? Or is there going to be some fallout that sticks much more long term? I know from talking to some of our clients that there's some concerns that the OEMs may refuse certain shipments, even if they're firm orders. Hopefully that doesn't happen, but I know there's a lot of concern over that. And I know there's also been concern expressed by our clients that the OEMs may try to push risk down the supply chain, which I think is probably the obvious risk to everybody who's on this call. So we wanted to talk a little bit about both the contract side of things and then also the employment side of things, and where we see some of these issues, and how folks can start thinking about planning for these shutdowns and how you can try to navigate through them. So
TJ, this is Bob Wolford. Before we move on from that point, the other thing that we didn't hit on, and I'd be curious on Steve's perspective on, is just the simple exercise of shuttering, the exercise and cost of the exercise of shuttering these facilities and then relaunching them again, both from a timing and a cost perspective. Can you give any insight into that, Steve, and the potential additional challenges that are going to arise given cash flow and just the sheer size of this industry and the just-in-time production?
Sure. I think, and part of the reason that GM is, I think, calling it a staged shutdown is just that, Bob. These are large industrial plants that have chemicals and paint lines and furnaces and things that, you can't just flip a switch and turn the lights off and walk out in the parking lot and come back in a month. So it does take time, and obviously people. So they're going to have to do it responsibly, and certainly even our middle market clients. If you're a casting facility and you've got a furnace, it's expensive to shut a furnace down and to start it back up. And what's not going to happen is on March 31st, the curve will be flattened and the government says everyone go back to work and we all go in and start making parts at 8:05. It's going to take days, similar to what happened with the strike with GM. And then if you think about the automotive just-in-time environment, right now people are walking off the job at assembly plants and there's trucks en route. So if you're a just-in-time supplier that ships 5 times a day to a JIT facility, a mile away from, pick a city in North America that has an assembly plant, what's that truck going to do? Where are those, component parts and assemblies and sub-assemblies going to go? Again, similar to the strike, some trailers were left in parking lots and rest stops, and it was a logistical nightmare for GM to find all the parts, get them sequenced and, back in line and start the facility up. So if we're down, I'd be shocked if we're back online March 31st, but let's say we're down a month. It's probably a full another month before we're running at whatever the new normal is. Right. So this is a couple month hit to the auto industry. And if you think about, 17 million SARs, we're running, 1.5 million units a month roughly. So you think about what's, capacity out of the system, some of these lines are running full bore, like the T1XX, for example. So there's going to be permanent lost production, even if the demand is there, which it likely won't be. So a 3 million reduction is not, out of the question. If you think about, we're running about 1.5 million units a month, rough math. And so if it takes a month of being down and then a month to get restarted, there's 3 million right there, of which probably half can't be made up due to, capacity limitations and things like that. So it's a long way of answering your question. It's severe and it's slow. It's slow to shut down, right, and it's slow to ramp up. And one other thing I'd like to bring up that I didn't earlier is all the new launches that are going on or were expected to go on in the industry for the next 24 to 36 months. We are in a record launch period at the moment, or we're in a record launch period at the moment. Lots of new product coming out. I mentioned T1XX, but that's the Escalade, the Yukon, the Suburban. That's sort of 3/4 launched, but the rest was supposed to launch this year. You got the Ford Bronco. You've got all this new product coming out that I think is going to be delayed. I know it's going to be delayed. It's just a matter of how long. And again, if you're a middle market supplier and you've tooled up and you've got machinery and equipment and people and launch costs sort of tied up that you're not able to invoice yet until you start shipping, you've got to be cognizant of that as well. And is it prudent to slow down the purchasing of your CapEx, or look to the customers to get reimbursement, perhaps in advance of piece price amortization? And obviously the Miller Johnson team can help you out with your contractual rights in that regard. But something else that I think is going to shake the industry up is launch. And I think a lot of that product that was scheduled to come out over the next 24 to 36 months is going to be delayed, perhaps even canceled.
One other question before we move to the contractual issues. You have, there are 5 OEMs right now who have indicated the intent to shut down, but that's not 100% of the customer base for a lot of our suppliers. And so, you mentioned earlier on the call, some of your clients are considering, do we send people home even if we have releases? What are your thoughts on managing your business if you have 50% of, if you're diversified beyond automotive and you potentially have other business that hasn't canceled, or you do work for one of the OEMs that's trying to push through this?
Or you ship to Mexico to a large tier OEM that hasn't shut down, right? Which is,
right.
Again, there's 3+ million units produced there, and I haven't heard what's happening there. So those are all very good questions. And, I think there's a commercial / practical question, and then there's maybe an ethical or moral question that you've got to ask yourself. And, if you have a customer in, pick a city in North America or in Mexico, or in the U.S. or in Mexico, and your customer has releases and demands and they're still running, do you want to continue to put your people at risk potentially? Are there things you can do to distance the employees, stagger shifts? Are you cleaning your facility? There's lots of, moral, ethical, and commercial decisions that the business owners on the phone need to make. I don't know what the right answers are, but absolutely, if your customer is demanding parts, they're going to expect you to ship parts. I don't know if anyone on this call ships to BMW, but I was pretty surprised as to the literature they put out to the supply base last week. It was pretty firm, and it basically said, you will ship. And I know we have a crisis, but you will ship, and you have contractual obligations, and we expect you to meet them. So,
in your conversations with the OEMs, is your sense that they feel like they're doing the right thing here, or do you think or is your sense that they feel like they're being forced by the UAW to take a more aggressive stance than is necessary to address this? Have you gotten?
Well, again, yeah, I mean, no one's going to say, we don't care about the people. But if you think about it, they sent the salaried workers home and said, you guys work from home. Be safe and work from home. But you union workers, you go to work and make parts because you can't work from home. That was sending a pretty bad message. And the union obviously recognized that. And I have a friend that is a plant manager at one of the assembly plants, which I won't mention, but there were some pretty heated debates. And I think, worker safety was a concern, right? People get freaked out, and some people think this is real serious, and others think it's, just a cold. And the people that think it's real serious don't want to come to work. Tensions were getting high at these facilities, and I don't think they had a choice. I really don't. I think the OEMs, had to do what they did. So for profits and production, I don't think they wanted to, but I think for safety of their people, they had to.
And Steve, this is CJ. One other question with the CDC and other government authorities coming out in the last couple of days and talking about the possibility that this pandemic could spread over the course of 18 months, right? Not just the next couple of weeks or next couple of months, but that it may end up being a cyclical thing through next year's flu season. I mean, have the OEMs or anybody else you've talked to considered more intermittent solutions or long-term solutions, or are we just focused on kind of the next couple of weeks for right now?
Haven't heard any long-term solutions or ideas. I'm sure it's being talked about, but right now it's crisis management, and people initially know that to be me. So I'm getting a lot of calls on what do we do tomorrow? So I would expect that there's going to be some long-term implications here. Rolling shutdowns, obviously more cleaning. But you look at what's happened with China and Korea, where there's a fair amount of, automotive production. They're coming back online. Not 100% back online, but back online nonetheless. So their new normal may be staggered shifts. And, if one or two or three people get it again, maybe there's, more rolling shutdowns. And so I don't know. I don't think anyone does. I don't think anyone honestly can say they know what the future is going to look like with this thing for the next couple of years. But my focus has been on, today, tomorrow, and next week.
Okay. We can move in, Bob, unless you have any other questions, we can move into the contract analysis, and then the employment questions. So I think on the contract side of things, and this is where my practice mainly focuses, once those end up in much more of a crisis situation and we're looking at litigation, but even in advance of that, how do you best tee things up through negotiations to make sure you're protecting your rights under the contract, and while you might be negotiating a resolution, what ultimately is the end goal and what levers do you have under the contract? So one of the things we've been telling our clients is, you know, as the OEMs are shutting down, as we're seeing this ripple through the auto supply industry and frankly all sectors of the economy at this point, is you got to immediately round up your contracts and take a look at them, including terms and conditions. You got to look up the supply chain. If you're a tier 2, look up to the tier 1. To the extent you have visibility to the OEM, look up there too. If you're a tier 1, look down to tier 2, tier 3. Just make sure you have a handle on what the contractual rights and responsibilities are in both directions up and down the chain. And we've outlined a couple of key issues to think about when you're looking at the contracts, and this is obviously stuff you know, your Miller Johnson attorneys can help with. Every contract's going to be different. There's going to be different issues under each contract. It's all going to have a little different language, but these are conceptual things to think about as you move through them. And we'll talk about some additional thoughts as we work through each of these questions. So the first one I always think about is, what type of contract are we dealing with here? Trying to get the slide to advance. So the first question we try to deal with, obviously, what type of contract? And you look at, primarily you're looking at either a fixed quantity contract or a requirements contract, and those have different legal risk profiles, obviously. The fixed quantity contracts obligate a buyer to buy and a seller to sell a certain quantity of goods during the contract term. So in this kind of situation, it may ultimately be an issue of timing, not necessarily an issue of quantity, right? If you've got a contract for 100,000 units or 1 million units or whatever it happens to be, and those have got to be sold between now and 2022, you know, maybe they were scheduled to go at a particular pace, but they'll get pushed off till after all of this calms down. Maybe there'll be some attempt to reduce that fixed quantity. But if you're looking purely at contractual rights, the fixed quantity contracts have your quantity locked in, and it's just a question of when is that quantity going to be produced and sold and purchased. And obviously that impacts cash flow and a whole bunch of other things, but at the end of the day, the quantity is still there. Requirements contracts are a different beast. They obligate the buyer to buy and the seller to sell actual good faith requirements during the contract term. And so under a very recent Michigan Court of Appeals case, that can be anywhere from one piece up to 100% of requirements. The Court of Appeals recently determined that it doesn't even have to be 100% of requirements, that you can split requirements contracts among various suppliers. And so there's definitely a much different risk profile on the requirements contract side. And that'll depend on the language, what it says in terms of the requirements, whether it's a particular percentage, whether it's 100%, whether it allows for split requirements among different suppliers. But the risk profile is that, you know, those requirements ultimately drop. And as Steve mentioned, perhaps we're not seeing a reduction in releases right now, but over the long term, you know, whether that's this year or into next year or whatever, there's probably going to be some reduction in requirements that suppliers are going to have to deal with. One legal issue to keep in mind on the requirements contract side is UCC 2306, which kind of sets a floor and a ceiling. It's not a fixed floor or a fixed ceiling, but it's something to think about. Orders under requirements contracts can't be unreasonably disproportionate to any estimate that was made in connection with the contract, or if there wasn't any estimate, what the normal orders look like. And so in practicality, what that means is if you have a supply contract where a tier 1 was offering to buy from you their requirements, but the quote was based on, you know, 1 million parts per year, if that tier 1 only orders 50,000 parts per year because the OEM demand has dried up, you know, that may be unreasonably disproportionate and ultimately a breach of the contract under 2306. That analysis changes a bit as you get closer and closer to what the estimate was. And on the flip side, if there's a spike in demand that comes after the plants reopen, that can also lead into unreasonably disproportionate territory. The rule of thumb is generally the further you get away from the estimate, the more likely it is to trigger 2306. And cause a breach situation, which may give you as a seller some remedies under the contract. And as in the buyer's position, you want to be conscious of that. You know, if you shut off the spigot entirely, for a lengthy period of time, you may wander into 2306 territory and have a breach situation you got to think about there.
And it's CJ, this is Bob. It does to the point that Steve made earlier. It seems as though we're going to be in a unique area where in the industry where really nobody has the ability to comply with their contractual obligations. And so while we are used to operating in an environment where the OEMs and the tier ones have very strong contractual leverage and the ability to at least attempt to leverage their way into what they want. In reality here, if this is going to work long-term for the industry, it would seem that there would need to be some alignment, throughout the supply chain as to treatment of these agreements and behaviors, and to the extent that if the plan for the OEMs and the tier ones is just to cram the crap downhill, that's not going to be viable. And part of the challenge, it would seem, is that to Steve's point, the OEMs and tier ones don't have the balance sheets to be able to fund this themselves. So it almost puts us into industry bailout territory. It seems like, given the costs associated with all of the activities that everyone has just announced.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And one of the points we'll touch on later on is, I don't want folks to forget that negotiated resolutions are always an option. And in a situation like this, where we're dealing with a pandemic that literally reaches every inch of the community, that's something to keep in mind, right? The industry, every part of it is going to be affected by this. Every part of the community is going to be affected by this. And we can talk about contractual rights and responsibilities and what levers you have and what levers you don't have, and, legal strategies. But, my own view of it from a legal perspective is those are all tools to use in conversations with your customers and with your suppliers. I think, Bob, to your point, that the more the industry as a whole can align on how these matters are going to be treated up and down the supply chain, the better it will be in the long term, right? I don't think that, just cramming things up or down the supply chain is necessarily going to solve anybody's problem over, the next year or 2 years.
Right. And that's page one of the playbook, obviously, traditionally. So hopefully,
right.
cooler heads can prevail.
And so a couple other things to keep in mind as you're evaluating, in the next couple of weeks, and what does that look like? When you're looking at your contracts, take a look to see what orders have to be accepted either by your customer or by you. Typically, you're looking at firm orders and material authorizations, but check the contracts. Everybody phrases that stuff a little bit differently. Some contracts in their terms and conditions have default rules. If the releases don't specify a particular set of firm orders or material authorizations, sometimes that's 4 weeks. I've seen them as long as 8 or 12 weeks. Just depends on what the particular set of terms and conditions say. And then, of course, the orders that can be rejected are the non-binding forecasts that you see on the releases. The couple of bullet points we have here under potential strategies, I want to be clear, are not necessarily strategies that we are recommending or advocating for. These are strategies that we may see moving here in the next couple of weeks. I think, to Steve's point, we haven't seen any major changes in releases from the OEMs right now, but that may switch. And, as you're looking at your own releases, make sure that you're keeping those as up to date as possible. One of the other things we've heard some concern about is, or as a potential strategy, is that customers may reject all orders, firm or otherwise, and then try to negotiate to make sure that there's no inventory buildup. Now that may be a risky situation depending on your contract language, and it's going to depend on the specific of each given situation. Maybe it makes sense in certain situations, but that's something to take a careful look at and also be prepared for if you're on the seller side of the equation. The other thing that we've had some discussions around on the seller side is, to the extent that demand does fall through, right? If releases do drop off here, if this is more protracted, do you choose to withhold shipments when production resumes until your prior orders are paid up, right? If your customer was in fact rejecting firm orders during the shutdown period, do you demand payment before you turn the spigot back on? But on the other hand, if you've been down for a couple weeks, it may just be in everybody's best interest to simply turn the spigot back on and try to get revenue flowing again. So those are just kind of the couple of things we've seen so far. And Bob or Steve or others on the call, I don't know if you've seen any other kind of negotiation strategies that have surfaced so far. I know this is only about 24 hours old, so we're still starting to see how things shape up. The other thing to look at under the contract are for potential escape hatches or release valves, whatever you want to call them, right? These are the out clauses that you can see under the contract. And there's some of the obvious ones, right? Cancellation rights. Do you as the buyer have certain cancellation rights? How broad are those cancellation rights? Can you cancel certain parts of the order? Can you cancel certain releases, or do you have to cancel the entire purchase order? And keep all of that in mind as you're thinking about that, right? You probably don't want to cancel the entire purchase order. I think the OEMs are going to have open back up here in a couple of weeks, or hopefully open back up here in a couple of weeks, and then you'll be left without any supply chain beneath you. But on the other hand, some contract language does allow you to cancel just certain parts of the order or certain releases. And so that's something to evaluate as you're having communications with your suppliers, with your customers. Force majeure clauses are another thing to take a look at. These exist in some supply contracts, not necessarily in all of them, and they're not necessarily mutual the way they are in other industries. Usually force majeure clauses are, things that I tell clients are out of reach. Usually they're very difficult to trigger, but in a pandemic situation like this, it's getting closer and closer to classic force majeure. Obviously, that's going to depend on the specific language of the force majeure clause. If there is act of government or pandemic or illness or similar kind of language in the force majeure clause, probably a pretty good chance it applies. And so it's something to take a look at to see what your rights are and potential responsibilities are under that clause. There's usually notice provisions and other things that you have to pay attention to. Another one to keep in mind, although it doesn't traditionally necessarily apply, or any price change clauses. I know that those are usually tied to materials or other things, but there may be language in there that you could leverage for this particular situation. Just thinking creatively about ways you might be able to get relief under some of the contracts. And then the other question that comes up frequently is the impracticability or impossibility of performance, either under the UCC or the common law. And we'll post on our website either later today or tomorrow a blog post kind of outlining some of the considerations under these particular issues. But the high level view is these are very high thresholds, particularly under Michigan law. UCC impracticability of performance is one thing to consider, but basically you've got to end up in a situation where it is objectively impossible to perform the contract before you're going to see much relief from the courts on the contract. And then of course there's the question of, are there any other clauses unique to your particular contract that might provide some relief in your situation? And that's of course something we can help evaluate. And this last point here is the one I made earlier and Bob echoed, and I think it's absolutely the right thing to keep in mind. Negotiated solutions are the preferred first step. This is a community-wide problem, and it's something we're all going to have to deal with as a community and as an industry. So definitely know your contract rights and know what you're obligated to do and what you can get out of before you go into those discussions. But it's absolutely worthwhile to have those conversations and try to get alignment amongst your supply chain partners before we start seeking more escalated relief. And with that, that's the end of the contract issues. unless Bob or Steve, you have anything. Otherwise, I'll turn it over to Keith to talk about some of the employment issues under the WARN Act.
Yeah, and I think, Keith, you know, to the extent that we have some tier 2 and tier 1 suppliers on the phone, I think it would be helpful, in addition to the WARN Act notice, to also talk about some of the various unemployment strategies, you know, that you can take here to assist your employees and maybe shed some of that cost as quickly as possible.
Yeah, absolutely, especially in light of the new federal legislation that was signed into law last night. I'll hit on that after I talk about WARN real quickly here. So WARN is very technical, as many of you may know. We're going to stay kind of at the higher level and talk about it just generally, refresher, and then kind of 3 paths that we're seeing for clients in light of current events and situations. And then I would stress that you know, it is technical. It requires some number crunching. So in each business's situation will be a little bit different. So if you have any questions at all, make sure you round this out, because remember, WARN typically requires 60 days advance notice of plant closures or mass layoffs, and failure to give that notice 60 days in advance could create liability for wages and benefits for employees who weren't provided the notice, up to 60 days worth. Now, the really good news on this front is there's an unforeseen business circumstance exception that many of you may have dealt with in response to the recent strike in your industry, and that was unforeseeable. So we are very confident that the relaxation and that exception will apply. And so then the question becomes more focused on, okay, what triggers my notice requirements and what should I do? So let me tell you, I guess let's review quickly on this slide kind of the triggering events, right? So it's a plant closing or a mass layoff. So plant closing is a permanent or temporary shutdown, and it's based on a single site of employment, but that can also be a single facility or a single operating unit within a particular facility. And if that single site of employment, there's an employment loss of 50 or more employees, then you are going to have a plant closing, whether it's, we'll talk about employment loss in a second. Mass layoff is the alternative, and the alternative is if you're going to lay people off, either if you lay people off and the layoffs exceed 500, or it's at least 50 full-time employees and 1/3 of your workforce, then that's going to be a mass layoff, and you got to crunch the numbers to figure that out. So 50 tends to be kind of a threshold number when we're looking at WARN Act requirements. Now, what's interesting in this context is to remember what we need 50 of to trigger WARN. You have to have 50 employees suffering an employment loss. And there are 3 types of employment loss. So the first is, hey, we're letting people go. So if you're letting, more than 50 people go and you have a plant of 100, and this is intended to be a permanent termination, then that's the first type of employment loss. My guess is that's not too many people. In this context, we're more talking about number 2, which is a layoff. But a layoff does not become an employment loss unless it exceeds 6 months, or you reasonably anticipate that it will exceed 6 months. And so what I've heard on the call and what I'm hearing from our clients is most folks are thinking that this may be a couple months, maybe 2, 3, on the longer end 4. So that may be a very good thing in defending whether or not there's a WARN notice obligation here. And then the third is a reduction in hours of more than 50% for any employee. So if you reduce their hours by 50%, that's considered just like a layoff exceeding 6 months. So that's kind of the background. And let me kind of outline what I would call 3 paths or decision-making paths that I think are pertinent in today's environment. The first is path A, right? So the first thing that we're telling clients is you got to look at, are you meeting the WARN Act notices right now? So if you decide you're going to lay off people next Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, you need to look at, do we have a plant closing? Do we have a mass layoff? Okay. And part of that analysis is going to be, do we anticipate the layoffs to be more than 6 months? If you meet the thresholds and you can reasonably expect that the layoffs will be longer than 6 months, then you should give the notices now. Now, a lot of our clients are saying, well, okay, well, we don't think we're going to hit that. We think this may go in waves. That's path B. So the second path that we're looking at is, okay, we don't think we have to give notice yet because we haven't met the threshold, or maybe we met the threshold for mass layoff, but we're not sure, in our reasonable business judgment, these are likely going to be 3 to 4 month layoffs. So those clients are saying, okay, when do I have to give notice if it turns out that we're wrong, right? Right now, it looks like it's 3 to 4 months. In a week, in a month, does it look like business circumstances change that it is going to be 6 months? And in that case, what you need to do is you don't give the notice now, but you have to bird dog it, and you got to track it, and you got to say, when do we think that it's going to be reasonable that these these layoffs are going to exceed 6 months? And that's a standard that's the standard that will apply is reasonable commercial business judgment. And so as long as we have good, strong evidence to show why we didn't think it was going to last 6 months, we're going to be on rock solid ground there. Now, someone else could always come in after the fact and second guess us, but we want to make sure if you're going down that path, we don't give the notice now and we track it. And once these layoffs go over the threshold and are likely to exceed or reasonably likely to exceed 6 months, you give the notice at that point. So that's the second path. The third path, or path C, is for any client that wants to just take the risk off the table. One thing WARN Act allows you to do is to say, look, we're going to give notice, we're going to do it in an abundance of caution, and the law encourages that, and you're not going to be penalized if you're wrong. So you could simply say, hey, we don't know what layoffs are going to happen. They're starting next Monday, next Tuesday, next Friday, whatever. We're giving you WARN notice now. We think it's indefinite. We don't know when it's coming back, but we're giving it now so that no one can claim that we didn't give the notice. And that's more, legally that can take the risk off the table. But as you can imagine, practically, the message that you have to send there to your employees is, yeah, we don't think this is necessary, but you just told them you think it was necessary, because they're not going to appreciate that you're trying to manage legal risk. And they're going to look at that and say, well, this must mean I'm done. And you may lose a lot of qualified people that say, well, I'm going to, if the industry bounces back in two months or 3 months, you could lose your people, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of practical implications on the third path. So that's kind of the three paths that we are advocating. The first one is check, do you have a WARN Act immediately in light of upcoming layoffs? 2, if you don't, are you gonna bird dog that and make sure that you're tracking that? And I should mention on that second path, the regulations require you to kind of look at a 90-day rolling period. So if you're going to slowly lay people off, 15 next week and then 20, that will all add up, and the regs tell us we got to look at a 90-day rolling period to see if we meet those thresholds, to see if we meet that 50 and 1/3 of your workforce for a mass layoff, if it's not a plant closing. So, but obviously there's real incentive to do it that way, because if you don't, and we're wrong and we don't give notice, once it's reasonable that these layoffs are going to be longer than 6 months, then the real legal risk is some plaintiff's lawyer says, hey, there's 500 employees that didn't get WARN notice. I think they should have gotten, or they got it, I think they should have gotten it 2 weeks earlier. And so that's what you'll fight about. And so we have some clients that maybe are opting opting to go with the third option, which sends a lot more, negative signals to the employees. Those are kind of the three options, I guess I would say. So with that, I would encourage anyone that's looking at layoffs or has laid off anyone in light of this to get with your counsel. We've got people that can help too, and figure out, are you going to hit these thresholds? If you are, get the notices out, get them out quickly. If it doesn't look like you are, but you might, then you need to put in place a system to make sure you're monitoring that to protect your legal and manage your legal risks. And then third, if you're the type of employer that says, hey, look, we don't care what message we send to employees. We want to be risk averse here. Let's get a notice out. We can work with you on that as well. So that's kind of the three WARN pieces there. If anyone has questions, happy to answer those. I should also mention the WARN Act threshold is 100 employees full-time. So if you're not over that, or you're close to that, or you're not sure, that's something you should take a look at to see if WARN Act applies. And the other important caveat here is, this is the federal WARN Act that I'm discussing. Each state may have its own, what we call mini WARN Acts. So I know California, other states have them. So if you have plants in other states, it's also important that you're taking a look at whether you have any state WARN Act obligations that you must comply with, because sometimes they're a little bit different. I would say the vast majority of those state laws are, track or are consistent with the federal legislation, but that's something you need to think about. So with that, if anyone has any WARN questions, I can answer those now or at the end, and I can move on maybe to Bob's point on unemployment and this new federal legislation. Okay, so I think with respect to unemployment, the Governor Whitmer issued an executive order 2020-10 recently, March 16th, that expanded unemployment benefits for Michigan workers who are impacted by COVID-19. It does not specifically expand unemployment benefits for employees who are laid off as a result of businesses who close for reasons related to either, you saw the executive order on the bars and restaurants, or something like here where the UAW has agreed because of health or safety concerns, we're going to shut down the plant, and there may be market concerns as well. So there's the executive order does not address that, but that doesn't mean that employees will not get unemployment. They will. If they are laid off and they want to work and they can't as a result of the impact that the OEM decisions have on suppliers downstream, they're going to be able to apply and get unemployment benefits consistent with the existing policies. The one thing that some of you may have seen yesterday, the state of Michigan issued an email guidance to all employers suggesting and encouraging them to not lay off or terminate employees, but to put them in some sort of temporary leave status. And what the guidance says, if you've seen this, you're aware of it, it says that if you put them in a temporary leave status, they'll still be eligible for unemployment benefits, but we also think then with the new federal Paid Leave Act that was part of the bill that President Trump signed last night, they may also be entitled to 14 days of paid sick leave plus another 10 weeks of 2/3 paid leave under the Family Medical Leave Act expansion. And we don't want employees in Michigan to get laid off and then not be eligible under that federal law, which takes effect on April 2nd. Okay, so that's what the state is telling employers. Our initial analysis of the federal legislation that passed last night is that anybody who is laid off before the effective date of April 2nd is not going to be eligible for that paid leave. So if I'm laid off next week, or a group of employees are laid off next week, and they might otherwise get 14, days of full pay at sick leave under the new federal legislation, plus the extra 10 weeks of FMLA, they wouldn't be entitled to that, and so the employers wouldn't have to pay that. So there's a cash liquidity and a financial benefit, to employers in terms of not having that additional obligation. Now, the state's position is, well, we want to make sure that everybody gets everything they're entitled to, so we want to put them in leave. So that's a decision each company has to make based on your, business situation and what you want to do for your employees. We're going to have a lot of clients, I suspect, that will want to make sure that they get everything they're entitled to, including under this new federal law. And if you fall in that camp, then you may want to consider whether you put them in some sort of paid temporary or unpaid temporary leave and let them get unemployment, and then under the new law you may have to provide them some paid leave. We have other clients, I'm sure, and other businesses, different situations that may say, hey, wait, we want to lay them off, let them get their unemployment. We can't afford to outlay cash, additional cash for paid leave for a significant number of our employees who would be eligible for that. That's a tough call. Now, the new legislation, I should say, does have a reimbursement mechanism for employers that have to pay the additional sick leave and additional FMLA paid leave. That's going to be done through a quarterly tax credit to the employer's Social Security taxes. And my understanding from our folks in the business department here at Miller Johnson is there's going to be some significant, moderate to significant delay there. So eventually employers who pay out those benefits may get reimbursed, but from a liquidity standpoint, that may be a concern as well. So,
Keith, this is Erik Daly. Real quick, just because this is such a fluid situation, I did want to state that on that point, with respect to the tax credits, Treasury, Federal Department of Treasury has put out announcements to the effect that to protect businesses concerned about cash flow, they will use their regulatory authority to advance funds to employers in a number of ways. Employers may be able to use cash deposited with the IRS to pay sick leave wages. And additionally, for businesses that would not have sufficient taxes to draw from, Treasury will use its regulatory authority to make advances to small businesses to cover the costs. Now, that's a regulatory authority process. I don't think we've seen the details on that yet, but I just wanted to footnote that as we discuss this topic as something you can probably expect to hear more about. So pardon the interruption. I'll send it back to you.
No, that's fantastic. I'm glad you jumped in there, right? So that's just another important point that factors into the analysis of, if there are going to be layoffs at your organization and you're going to make that decision, right? You've got the WARN Act considerations, you got Unemployment Act requirements, and then you got this new federal legislation that just came down last night, and making sure you understand if you choose to put them in a leave status and you take on those obligations, then, what's that look like? How are you going to get tax credit for that and the timing? So those are all very important things. I did get one question, sorry I missed it earlier, on the WARN piece, and that was whether Michigan has a WARN Act separately. The answer is no. So in Michigan, if your plants are in Michigan, then you're going to be covered by the federal WARN Act only. So that's the answer to that. And so I guess I will say this, we have our employment group is ready to walk through this new federal legislation. So if you have folks that you want to learn more about whether it applies to them, what it means, April 2nd, we have another webinar scheduled for Monday, going through the ins and outs of that. And I'm sure we'll have much more on the tax credit and how that would work for Monday as well. Anything else on the panel? You guys are more in this industry than I am, so is there anything else from an employment perspective that you think we should address here, or questions?
I didn't have anything extra. We did have one question from Elizabeth Hannings on asking if Michigan has a WARN Act, and if so, if it's on track with the federal act. That's a good question, Elizabeth.
Yeah, and I thought I just answered that. Yes, or no. I'm sorry. Michigan does not have a separate WARN Act. So if you're in Michigan and your facility's in Michigan that you were worried about, then you're going to have to worry about the federal WARN Act only.
This, Keith, this is Erik Daly speaking again. One other big picture consideration, not an immediate takeaway right now, but because I think it may ultimately broaden out to cover industries beyond healthcare supplies, medical devices, and the like, is the fact that I think there's a lot of support building around invoking the Defense Production Act for essentially conscripting business into shifting capacity to produce medical supplies, face masks, ventilators, things like that. That has obvious implications outside of the auto industry. But, you know, from quickly researching the Defense Production Act and some of the authority that Congress and the executive branch have under that act, I think we can probably expect to see more ideas floated in the weeks ahead about how that legislation may be used for other industries that are not so obviously related to the healthcare issues. So I again, not an immediate takeaway for this group, but something that we will probably be following up on, as it may ultimately impact industries outside of healthcare and medical devices.
Yeah, no, those will be new developments, and I'm sure we'll put up our updates as soon as anything changes on those, and we'll be prepared to answer any employment-related questions there as well.
Okay, we are at the end of our hour, and I think we've addressed the questions. We appreciate everybody spending time with us today during this very turbulent period. And if you're not on our mailing list, you can email any of us to be included. We'll continue to send out daily alerts and host daily morning webinars on different topics. So thank you. Stay safe. Wash your hands and have a good day.